Hi, and welcome to another episode of Piano TV. So today is part 2 of our classical period music video. So if you didn't see the first part, you might want to click the screen and check that out so you know what's going on. So in the last video, just to quickly recap, we talked about some of the developments in classical music, what became important genres, we talked about instrumental music and all that good stuff. So you can check that out if you haven't already. In today's video, part 2, we are going to discuss some of the genres that really blossomed and became a thing. Like sonatas became a thing, string quartets, symphonies. We're going to talk about the composers who innovated them and listen to a few examples. We'll also talk about the development of music towards the end of the classical era, where you had a new crop of musicians like Beethoven and Schubert who were changing things even further. So let's get started. So first things first, we need to talk about sonata form, and that was a really popular sort of song structure that was used in a lot of different things in the classical period. So just for a point of comparison, I want you to think about pop music for a minute. Even if you haven't spent a lot of time analyzing the form of pop music, you're probably familiar with the basic principles of its verse chorus form. So just for example, this would be the structure of a very typical pop song. You'd have an introduction, then you'd have verse 1 and a chorus. Then you'd have verse 2 and a chorus, and then maybe you have a bridge where something's a little bit different, and then you finish off with another chorus and an ending. So that would be the typical modern pop music structure. So I wanted to bring up pop music because I wanted to give you an idea that a certain song structure can basically define all music for, well, not all music, I'm kind of over exaggerating here, but for a very large period of time. And this sort of verse chorus song structure has been the norm in contemporary music for years and years and years, and it'll probably continue to be the norm. So that was sonata form in the classical era. It was super popular. It was used in all different kinds of music, and it was just kind of accepted as the standard, accepted as the norm. So without going into too much detail about what sonata form is, because again, that's a whole other video, it's a really rich topic. But sonata form in its simplest form has 3 different parts. So it has the exposition, which is the main part, the main tune. It has the development, which kind of takes that main tune and twists it around and turns it, and it goes in all different kinds of ways. And then you have the recapitulation, which goes back to the exposition and kind of restates that main part. So just one more time here. So we have exposition, development, recapitulation, and that's the basic version of sonata form. You'll see sonata form pop up in all kinds of genres in classical music. In sonatas, usually the first movement, you'll see it as the first movement in string quartets, in different symphonies and concertos. It's just all over the place. So now let's talk about the sonata as a genre. So sonata is kind of confusing, but sonata was a song structure like we just talked about, but it was also the name for an entire genre of instrumental music. So, I mean, I'm sure you've seen keyboard pieces or violin pieces or cello pieces or whatever, sonata in D major type thing. So these sonatas as a genre emerged in the Baroque period, and there were guys like Scarlatti in the Baroque period who wrote over 500 keyboard sonatas, but they definitely changed and became something bigger and more advanced than what it was in the Baroque period. So you had guys like Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven who took sonatas and really kind of developed them to their highest form. So a sonata in the classical era had 3 to 4 movements. Usually the first movement was in sonata form and it was fast, followed by a second movement which would be slow and kind of chill, kind of your little break. And then if there was a third movement, it would be a minuet. And then the fourth movement would be usually a pretty lively finale. And again, exceptions to the rule, because you have tunes like Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, where the first movement, everyone knows, it's really dark and slow and somber. But in general, that's how a sonata worked. Sonata means a piece played, whereas a cantata, just by comparison, means a piece sung. So sonatas were always instrumental. So now let's shift our focus to another genre of instrumental music that was super popular in the classical era, and that is the symphony. So these were so popular mainly because aristocrats really liked them and would pay musicians to create them. In the early classical period, symphonies weren't necessarily the huge productions that they grew to be in the future of the classical period, and that's kind of how we know symphonies now in the modern era. If we go to the symphony, it's going to be ton of people playing on in a giant hall. But in the early days, symphonies were a little bit smaller, and even if you were an aristocrat that didn't have like a huge performance space, you could still like have performances of symphonies at your home. And then your friends could come over and you could all like have a good time. Since Joseph Haydn wrote at least 107 symphonies in the classical period, he is definitely worth bringing up when we're talking about symphonies, especially because he was nicknamed as the father of the symphony. He's also nicknamed as the father of the string quartet, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Haydn didn't invent the symphony, but since he had such massive output, he basically created the gold standard of what we now think of as the symphony, and he inspired tons and tons of imitators to create symphonies, sort of like how he had crafted them. The symphony itself originated with string instruments, and then eventually it brought in oboes, and then it brought in horns, and then horns and oboes at the same time, and then later came, bassoons and timpanis and flutes and clarinets and all that good stuff, so that by the end of the 1700s, we would have what we now consider the modern symphony. So we have this awesome guy, Haydn, who basically created the standard template for what a good symphony should be. Were there any other really awesome symphonies being created aside from just him? It turns out there was. And if you've seen the video on Mozart's sort of bio, his history, you'll know that Haydn and Mozart were bros, and Haydn considered Mozart to be one of his only true musical peers. Mozart himself wrote at least 47 symphonies, and they're also very awesome and worth checking out. You probably already have a pretty good understanding of what a symphony sounds like, but I still want to show you just a few seconds of one of Haydn's symphonies because he wrote so many and he wrote a lot of really awesome ones. So the one we're going to listen to today is his 100th symphony, also nicknamed the Military Symphony. And the reason I picked this one is because it has this characteristic lightheartedness, but also has some like kind of neat, interesting twists and turns. As mentioned earlier, we have Haydn to thank for another classical genre, and that is the string quartet. So quartet means four, so a string quartet has two violins, a viola, and a cello. Haydn didn't create the genre, kind of like the symphony, but he did so much with it that he's considered, again, like I mentioned, the father of the string quartet. He really established it as a genre in the 1750s, and generations of imitators came after him, such as Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert, who put their own spin on the genre. So since we're gonna have a discussion about how classical music transitioned in the late classical period into more of like the romantic style that we associate with the 1800s, I thought it would be fitting to bring in an example of Beethoven and talk about one of his string quartets. Now, this one I really wanted to show you because he considered it himself to be his most perfect work. So if you got a guy like Beethoven who's creating like amazing work all the time and he's saying like, this is my best, this is awesome, then that makes me really interested. And it's not just him who thought it was a really, really awesome work. When Schubert heard it, he was quoted, Schubert himself being a very excellent musician, and we'll talk about him in a second. He is quoted as saying about this string quartet, "After this, what is left for us to write?" And he even wanted to hear it on his deathbed, so that's how much he liked it. So this is Beethoven's Opus 131, string quartet in C sharp minor. That quartet we were just listening to was actually composed in 1826, which makes it one of Beethoven's most romantic sounding pieces, because that's around the time that the classical era ended and the romantic era began. So backtracking a little bit, by 1790, that was really when the classical music sound had hit its peak, and it was just considered the standard, and you had guys like Haydn and Mozart and tons of imitators kind of perpetuating this sound. But around 1790, you had guys like Beethoven and Schubert, who were in their early 20s, and they took the standard, but they started really shifting it in a different direction, generally like a more complex and darker direction. Obviously, there were more people involved in creating this shift towards a different sounding musical style than just Beethoven and Schubert, but those are the two that I really want to focus on today because I think they're both like pretty important and influential in that development. So towards the end of the classical period, music started to get more intense, dramatic, and larger in scope. As I mentioned earlier, the symphony expanded, became bigger. There was more of an emphasis on minor keys, so it got like a little bit darker as a result. Also a little bit more emotional than the sort of crystal clear purity of Mozart music, which can be moving and emotional, but just became a little bit more human towards the end of the classical era into the romantic era. So for a last example of a late classical, early romantic piece, I did want to bring up something by Schubert, and his name isn't as well known to us as people like Mozart and Beethoven, partly because he only lived to be 31, and also because he only had one public performance of his own pieces in his lifetime. But he was friends with lots of really amazing musicians, and lots of really amazing musicians considered him to be amazing too. And I think Schubert's definitely worth looking into. So I'm going to show you what I consider a very modern sounding piano sonata that he wrote in B flat major, D 960. And we're going to be looking at the slow second movement. I really encourage you to listen to the whole thing because I'm obviously only going to show you about 30 seconds, but the second movement is just, it's so simple and has such clarity, and I think that just makes it so beautiful. It's not cluttered, but it still has like a very powerful effect when you listen to it. And it gets a little bit faster. I'm not going to show you the faster part, but to me it sounds like super modern, really interesting. So let's take a listen to that. And that concludes our part 2 discussion on classical period music. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I really like nerding out about history topics with you guys, so hopefully you enjoy it as much as I do. And if you haven't already subscribed, you can do that and give this video a like if you enjoy music history as well, and I'll catch you next time. And that concludes part 2 discussion.